The Present Age, Banic in the year 1300, a contemporary analysis by master historian Aldric Greymantle, or The Current Disasters. You're all too busy scheming to notice while I waste ink, recording what you'll ignore, the ruling house of Banic. Pay attention, these are the people who will still be fleecing you after you're dead. Though why I bother explaining this to an audience that won't read past the first paragraph is beyond my comprehension, the current Duke, Edric Banic, presides over the ringed city from the innermost ducal ring with a firm hand and calculating mind. Unlike some of you credulous fools who believe leadership is about noble bearing and inspiring speeches, and I know you believe this because I've heard your tavern philosophizing, Duke Edric understands that power in Banic, real power, comes from mastering the art of political maneuvering in a lawless duchy where everyone is looking for a bribe and way up, even the law. His skills in bribery, leadership, and political scheming ensure his continued supremacy over the 19 mercenary lodges and the fractious noble houses that circle like hungry wolves. This is not corruption, you moralizing simpletons. This is governance in a city whose entire history has taught it that trust kills and pragmatism survives. Though naturally, you'll continue calling it corruption while simultaneously participating in it. The hypocrisy would be amusing if it weren't so exhausting to document. Beside him rules Duchess Lyrian Banic, patron of the arts and a formidable political force in her own right. And before you dismiss her as some decorative noble wife, which I know you will because you dismissed the last 3 duchesses the same way until they had you imprisoned, understand this. She maintains the delicate balance between displaying cultural refinement to mask the city's corruption and wielding ruthless pragmatism to maintain control. Beauty concealing brutality, the essence of Banic distilled into a single person. Not that any of you appreciate the artistry of it. You're too busy calculating your next bribe. Their wealth is staggering. Provinces, fiefdoms, and trading enterprises that stretch across the duchy's territories, including charcoal-producing towns that apparently no one bothered to protect adequately. We'll get to that disaster shortly, assuming any of you are still reading, which you're not. The question of succession, or how history repeats itself for those too arrogant to study it, which is all of you. The succession presents complications that reflect Banic's troubled nature, though anyone who'd read the accounts of our previous 6 ducal transitions could have predicted this exact scenario. But of course, none of you read. You're nobles, you have servants to read for you, except your servants are as illiterate as you are morally. Princess Arryn Banic, the elder child and heir apparent, trains diligently in naval warfare and leadership, seeking to prove herself worthy of inheriting the ringed city. She represents continuity, a ruler who would maintain House Banic's traditional power structures. Sensible. Predictable, exactly what a stable transition requires. Naturally, we cannot have that. Because when has Banic ever chosen the sensible path? I've been documenting this city's decisions for 43 years, and I cannot recall a single instance where we collectively chose wisdom over spectacle. Her younger sibling presents a different proposition, though I remain deeply skeptical of the hysterical rumors circulating about Prince Bartholomew Banic. Yes, he studied at the Library of Silverkeep. Yes, he returned with some theoretical knowledge of magical systems. But the breathless tales of him mastering the law of beasts and commanding nature itself. Pure fantasy from gossips who've read too many romance novels and not enough actual grimoires. I've studied magical theory. I've catalogued every documented case of successful thaumaturgical practice in the past 3 centuries. Do you know how many nobles claimed magical prowess? 47. Do you know how many actually possessed it? 3. And 2 of those were frauds who got lucky with timing. Magic requires discipline, focus, and years. Decades of rigorous study. Not 5 years of university dabbling while socializing with other privileged youth. The idea that a young prince, attractive and ambitious, always a catastrophic combination, as I documented in the succession crisis of 1247 that none of you remember because none of you read my account of it, could master ancient laws between wine parties and philosophical debates is laughable. But you all want to believe it because magic makes for better dinner conversation than the mundane reality of succession politics. So you repeat these rumors, embellish them, turn a moderately educated prince into some kind of sorcerer king from children's stories. His goals are ambitious. He makes no secret of wanting greater influence and perhaps even the ducal throne itself. This is normal. This is what younger princes do. They scheme, they build factions, they position themselves. It's politics, not sorcery, but because you've dressed it up in magical nonsense, you're completely missing the actual threat he represents. A charismatic alternative to his sister, who can rally traditionalist nobles unhappy with a female heir. That's the succession crisis. Not fireballs and summoned beasts, but the same dreary pattern of ambitious younger siblings we've seen 17 times before, all available in the archives. All unread, all forgotten. All about to be repeated because you people treat history like an optional entertainment rather than a survival manual while chasing fantasies about magical princes. The power structure, the machinery of exploitation you benefit from daily while pretending not to understand how it functions. The Duke's household reflects centuries of paranoid governance, paranoia earned through bitter experience, I might add. Though I'm certain you believe yourselves above such primitive fears, despite sitting atop the same powder keg that has exploded 6 times in documented history. Castellan Godric commands not a standing army, which the dukes have refused to maintain since the time of transformation, and wisely so, though I'm sure half of you think this decision was made out of cowardice rather than strategic brilliance, but rather 5 ranks of city watch that have been used to guide the city. The duke's true power lies in coordinating the city's mercenary lodges when necessity demands unified action beyond the city limits or in extreme cases within the city, although there is always a danger to this kind of move. Overall, with a few missteps over the past centuries, it is a brilliant administrative design. The Duke, through the Castellan, wields military force without controlling a force that could depose his master. I wrote extensively about this system's development in my comprehensive analysis of post-imperial governmental structures. That manuscript took me 7 years to complete. 12 people have checked it out from the archives. 12. In 24 years. I know who you are, I keep records. And none of you finished reading it. Seneschal Ilara presents perhaps the most fascinating evolution of Banic's corruption. And when I say fascinating, I mean historically inevitable and utterly predictable to anyone who bothered reading the last 400 years of administrative records. A noble warden who has embraced the darker path, she commands both the bailiffs in each village and the road wardens who patrol the routes between Banic and its resource towns, both of which buy their places directly from the Duke through her. Let that sink in. The law enforcement officials purchased their positions. This isn't aberrant corruption. This is the logical endpoint of our historical trajectory. When trust died during the imperial occupation, transactional relationships became the only reliable bonds. I explained this developmental arc in painstaking detail in 1282, with footnotes and cross-references and primary source documentation from the imperial period that I personally translated from Old Meridian, which took 3 years of my life. You know how many citations that work has received in subsequent scholarship? 0. Because there is no subsequent scholarship, because none of you read, let alone write. Her dual nature, simultaneously administrator and criminal, perfectly embodies how deeply corruption has woven into Banic's governance. She oversees the city's charcoal reserves, making her intimately aware of the mysterious fires consuming towns in the hinterlands. Which raises an obvious question that apparently no one has bothered to ask except me. The old man shouting into the void. What does she know? When did she know it? And what is she profiting from it? But by all means, continue your dinner parties and your merchant negotiations while the economic foundation of your wealth burns. I'll be here, documenting your negligence for future historians who will ignore my work as thoroughly as you've ignored every historian who came before me. The greater nobility wolves, circling the throne, as always, completely ignorant of the last 6 times this exact scenario played out beyond the ducal family. 2 barons hold significant power, and if you don't understand why these 2 specifically matter, you've learned nothing about strategic resources and military capability, which you haven't. Because you don't read, because you're too busy embezzling from each other to develop basic geopolitical literacy. Baron Clark Darkhaven, admiral and ruler of a key port city, commands Banic's naval forces. Despite the Coral Wall's restrictions on large-scale naval warfare, restrictions we paid for in blood, remember? No, of course you don't remember. You weren't there, and you certainly haven't read any of the 12 comprehensive accounts of the Coral Wall's creation that I've personally catalogued and indexed. Banic maintains a fleet for coastal defense and the dangerous navigation of coral passages. Darkhaven's expertise in seamanship and his command of an actual fleet make him indispensable to the Duke. Indispensable. Mark that word. In Banic's political structure, indispensable means dangerous. The Duke cannot afford to lose him, which means the Admiral can afford to take risks. His alliance with Caspian Blackwood's fire dancers and performers suggests Darkhaven understands that power in Banic requires both military might and popular support. A sophistication most nobles lack entirely. I documented this exact pattern with Admiral Gareth in 1234. He became indispensable. Then he became ambitious. Then he attempted a coup. Then he became dead. All predictable, all documented, all apparently erased from your collective memory because reading about the past might interfere with your busy schedule of repeating it. Baron Cedric Greenleaf serves as magistrate and protector of Banic's forests and natural resources, the very charcoal-producing woodlands now threatened by systematic destruction. His position has grown increasingly precarious as towns burn, yet somehow he remains in office. Why? Either incompetence or complicity. There are no other options, though I'm sure you'll invent a third option that absolves everyone of responsibility while the forests continue burning and your forges go cold. The Baron's association with Piper Green's nature-inspired performers hints at his connection to the rural communities that feed Banic's forges. Yet his documented skills in bribery, embezzlement, and criminal enterprise reveal that even the protector of natural resources participates fully in Banic's culture of corruption. So when charcoal towns burn, we must ask, is the fox guarding the henhouse or is the fox eating the hens? Not that you'll ask, not that you'll investigate, not that you'll do anything except wring your hands and commission another useless committee, while I sit here documenting your incompetence for an audience that doesn't exist, and a future that increasingly looks like it won't arrive because you're all too busy looting to notice the fire. Current crises, or the disasters you're ignoring while counting your coins, and I waste what remains of my eyesight documenting for posterity that will never read these words, the burning of the hinterlands and the revolutionary. You're ignoring the most immediate threat you're all pretending doesn't concern you while I scream into the archive's darkness. The most immediate threat facing Duke Edric's reign is the systematic destruction of countryside towns. Their entire populations are being killed or joining what appears to be a coordinated countryside uprising. Let me state this plainly, since you all seem determined to minimize it. And I know you're minimizing it because I attended last week's council meeting where Baron Hemsworth called it unfortunate rural unrest, and you all nodded like the sheep you are. This is not banditry. This is not random violence. This is systematic destruction of the economic infrastructure that supports the city of 1,000 forges. And I have a theory, one that I've been trying to bring to the Duke's attention for 8 months now, though apparently my decades of accurate historical analysis count for nothing when competing with Baron Hemsworth's reassuring platitudes about temporary disturbances. The pattern is too organized, too strategic. Someone is building an army out there. Someone is systematically destroying our fuel supply while simultaneously recruiting the survivors to their cause. The attacks target specific towns in a specific sequence. Always the most isolated first, always leaving time for word to spread before the next attack, always positioning refugees to flow toward rebel-held territories rather than toward Banic. This is military strategy. This is someone who understands logistics, psychology, and revolutionary organization. I've cross-referenced every report from the road wardens, the few who've survived, and the many who've conspicuously stopped sending reports. And the name that keeps appearing in witness testimonies is Il, a revolutionary, a leader who apparently materialized from nowhere and built an army of bandits out of nothing, someone who promises to overthrow the nobility, bring the duchy to its knees, remake Banic into something new. And what is the Duke's council doing about this? Nothing. Because Ale sounds like a peasant name. Because the testimonies come from traumatized survivors and drunken road wardens. Because it's easier to believe in random chaos than organized revolution. I've documented 17 peasant uprisings in our history. I know the pattern. I know the signs. And this systematic destruction combined with ideological recruiting, this is what successful revolutions look like in their early stages. But you'll ignore it. You'll minimize it. You'll keep treating it as banditry until Ael's army is at the gates and you're shocked. Shocked that the peasants you've been exploiting for centuries finally organized effective resistance. I wrote about this vulnerability in 1289, in detail, with maps with economic projections, with historical parallels to the charcoal crisis of 891 that you've all forgotten because, say it with me now, you don't read. Charcoal doesn't appear magically. Those forges you profit from require fuel. Those same people need grain and meat. That fuel and food comes from towns you've deliberately impoverished to maximize your margins. And now those towns are burning, along with their populations and productive capacity, and their survivors are joining someone who promises revolution. This is not complicated. This is cause and effect. This is historical pattern recognition. This is basic strategic analysis. And you're all too busy arguing about festival decorations and trade agreements to notice that someone is building a revolutionary army 80 miles from your walls. Seneschal Ilara, who commands the road wardens tasked with managing peace in the countryside, surely knows more than she reveals. Of course she does. She profits, as wardens profit from the land they are meant to protect, but more often prey on. But has she mentioned this AL in her reports? Has she acknowledged the organizational sophistication of these attacks? Has she explained why entire road warden patrols have gone silent? No, because that would require admitting she's lost control of the countryside. That would require acknowledging that someone out there is better at organizing than she is. That would require honest assessment rather than comfortable lies. Baron Greenleaf, charged with protecting these very resources, faces questions about his competence or complicity. Questions he has not adequately answered, you'll notice. Questions that should have been asked 6 months ago when the first town burned. Questions that should have been asked by someone other than the exhausted old historian who isn't even invited to policy meetings. This war, and it is a war, stop calling it troubles in the provinces like you're discussing bad weather, threatens not merely individual towns, but the entire economic foundation of our city. Without charcoal, the forges go cold. Without forges, Banic's wealth evaporates. Without wealth, the mercenary lodges turn on their employers. And with a revolutionary army at our gates, promising those same mercenaries a share of noble wealth, the chain of consequences is blindingly obvious to anyone with basic reasoning capability, which apparently excludes everyone currently in power. I've seen this before. 1087. The fuel wars, extensively documented, 3 years of urban collapse, 40,000 dead from starvation and mercenary violence, all because the nobles ignored the warning signs until it was too late. History doesn't repeat, but it rhymes. And AL, whoever IL is, seems to understand the rhyme scheme better than any of you. Quick question for those still reading. Why haven't Banic's vaunted mercenary companies been set to solving this problem? The bidding process takes months, but no preparations. The company captains have not even been invited to the ducal ring for the usual wining and dining that starts the process. Basically, the duke, the nobles, the civics, and the city are doing nothing as the lands that feed and fuel Banic burn. The imperial conspiracy, or the coordinated effort to restore foreign domination that you're too blind to see, but here's what truly keeps me awake at night, staring at documents by candlelight while you all sleep peacefully in your ill-gotten luxury. I believe the revolutionary threat and our other crises are not separate problems but pieces of a larger conspiracy. Someone wants Banic weakened, someone wants our economic foundation destroyed, someone wants our attention divided between internal succession struggles and external threats. Someone wants us vulnerable, and I believe that someone wants to bring the empire back. Mock me if you want, Call me a paranoid old man seeing patterns in chaos, but I've been studying imperial administrative documents for 43 years. I know how they think, I know how they operate. I know that they never relinquish territorial claims willingly. We bought our independence with the Coral Wall, with 56,000 lives sacrificed to Nethalos over 560 years. The Empire accepted this because the wall made reconquest impossible. But what if the wall could be bypassed? What if new methods of travel these Warren Gates people whisper about could render our blood-bought protection obsolete? Then suddenly, reconquest becomes viable again. Suddenly, all those imperial claims and grievances and wounded pride become actionable. And what would an imperial reconquest strategy look like? First, destabilize the current regime, create succession crises, promote rumors of magical threats, whether real or fabricated, to make the ruling house seem weak and vulnerable. Second, destroy economic foundations, burn the charcoal towns, starve the forges, reduce Banic's wealth and military capacity. Third, foment internal rebellion. Find a charismatic revolutionary, perhaps even create one, and use them to build an army that will weaken Banic while believing they're fighting for freedom. The Empire has done this before. In Meridia, in the northern provinces, in 6 other territories I've documented. Fourth, wait. Let us tear ourselves apart. Let the revolutionary army and the Duke's forces bleed each other. Let the succession crisis fracture noble loyalties. Let economic collapse turn the mercenary companies mercenary. Fifth, arrive as peacekeepers. Restore order. Accept Banic's voluntary return to imperial protection. It's elegant. It's efficient. It's exactly how they reclaimed the coastal provinces in 1147. And you know what the most damning evidence is? The timing. Everything happening simultaneously. Succession crisis and revolutionary uprising and economic sabotage and rumors of magical threats and whispers of Warren Gates all at once. That's not coincidence. That's coordination. I've brought this theory to the Duke's Council 3 times. 3 times. Each time I'm thanked for my creative thinking and dismissed so you can discuss tariff rates and festival planning and which merchant house has the most favorable bribery schedule. Meanwhile, I've been quietly tracking certain patterns. Noble visitors from former imperial territories supposedly here for trade negotiations. Unusual movements of ships along the coast, particularly near known imperial naval routes. Documents in the archives, our archives that have been accessed by people whose signatures don't match our standard scribal hands. Gold flowing into Banic from sources that make no economic sense unless you consider imperial intelligence budgets. The fact that Seneschal Elara's family held titles under the imperial administration and lost them during independence. I'm not saying she's a traitor. I'm not saying any specific noble is an imperial agent. I'm saying the patterns are there for anyone with eyes to see and knowledge to interpret them. But you won't see them. Because seeing them would require reading, would require studying imperial administrative history, would require understanding how intelligence operations work across decades rather than quarters. You're merchants playing at nobility. You think in terms of next season's profits. The Empire thinks in terms of centuries. And while you count your coins and plot your petty schemes, they're rebuilding the structures that will reclaim you. The magical threat that isn't why we restricted magic for good reason, you fools. But this particular rumor is nonsense. Now regarding Prince Bartholomew and these absurd rumors about him wielding the law of beasts and commanding devastating natural forces, let me be absolutely clear. This is exactly the kind of distraction that serves imperial interests. Think about it. Really think, which I know is difficult for you, but try. What better way to destabilize a succession than to promote wild rumors about the younger heir possessing supernatural power? It divides the court. It frightens the nobility. It makes rational succession planning impossible because everyone's too busy gossiping about sorcery to notice actual political maneuvering. I've written 4 separate treatises on the historical regulation of magical practice in Banic. 4 extensively footnoted, cross-referenced with imperial records, analyzing every documented instance of magical practice over the past millennium. Real magic is rare, vanishingly rare. It requires decades of discipline. It requires natural talent. Venerable Grand Historian Tudis Dale suggested a ratio of 1 in 100,000, although his calculations for those numbers were lost to the damp nearly 50 years past. Tudis noted that was the natural ratio in the population, and that was before the long reign of Fireguard from behind Mir's throne and his hunt for any that possessed the tiniest of magical sparks. Refer volumes 7 to 9 for my summary of Tudis's lost histories of Mir. Even if a talent was found in this day and age, it requires resources and training that simply aren't available. Footnote: see my most recent notations on Silverkeep and rumors of the ancient three disasters, Isorn Glimmer, Narak Shadako, and Lilymindel Fireguard. Yes, the witch hunter's grandson, that have surfaced in recent years for a collection of rumors that might be worth following up on, providing funds were available. But fake magic, rumors of magic, the fear of magic, that's cheap, that's easy. That's exactly what an intelligence operation would cultivate. I'm not saying the prince isn't ambitious, he clearly is. I'm not saying he's not dangerous to his sister's succession, he obviously is. I'm not saying he didn't study magical theory at Silverkeep, he probably did. I'm saying the leap from studied magical theory to commands the law of beasts is exactly the kind of exaggeration that serves someone's interests. And I don't think those interests are Banic's. You know how many times those treatises have been consulted by current policymakers? I checked the archive logs. Once, Baron Hemsworth's assistant checked out Volume 2 in 1297, returned it 3 days later with the pages still stuck together, unread. So you'll believe wild rumors about magical princes while ignoring actual documented patterns of imperial manipulation. Perfect, absolutely perfect. Meanwhile, the real threats march closer while you chase fantasies. The Warren Gates, the threat that makes all your other concerns irrelevant and which you'll ignore until imperial soldiers are standing in your counting houses. If they're not already here, recent discoveries of interdimensional warrens offering potential land bridges could bypass the coral wall entirely. Do you understand what this means? Let me explain it in terms even merchants can grasp, though I have vanishingly little hope that you're still reading this section because most of you stopped at the first paragraph. We paid for the coral wall with 100 imperial sailors' lives initially, and 100 more every year for the past 560 years. That's 56,000 human sacrifices to maintain a barrier that has kept the Empire away from our shores. If Warren Gates allowed the Empire to bypass the coral wall, then 56,000 people died for nothing. The protection purchased with annual blood sacrifices to Nethalos becomes worthless. The entire strategic assumption underlying northern security for half a millennium collapses. And here's the question no one else is asking. Who is discovering these Warren Gates? Who is mapping them? Who is determining their strategic utility? Because if it's imperial agents, and I have 6 documented instances of imperial scholars researching dimensional theory over the past 9 decades, then they're not just discovering bypass routes. They're preparing invasion corridors. I've been warning about magical bypass possibilities since 1284. Since the first reports of Warren manifestations reached Banic, I wrote a comprehensive analysis. I presented it to the Duke's Council. I was thanked for my interesting theoretical work and dismissed so you could discuss tariff rates on Glenish pottery. Tariff rates. While dimensional doorways threaten to render our primary strategic defense obsolete. Duke Edric reads books in Banic's oldest libraries. Perhaps the only place accurate histories of the Empire's mark on these lands still exist. He considers whether he must prepare for possibilities his ancestors never imagined. Invasion not by sea, but through doorways between worlds. At least someone is thinking strategically. Though it's cold comfort that the one person in power who reads is preparing for an apocalypse that everyone else will ignore until it's already happened. But I would urge His Grace to consider, what if the Warren Gates aren't a natural phenomenon? What if they're being created? What if imperial mages have been working for decades to develop exactly this capability? Because that would mean everything happening now. The succession crisis, the revolutionary uprising, the economic sabotage, is preparation, weakening us before the final blow. And when that blow comes, it won't be through the coral wall we've spent centuries maintaining. It'll be through doorways that appear in the ducal ring itself. Meanwhile, the rest of you argue about tariff rates and succession gossip and which merchant house has the most favorable bribery schedule with the civic ring bureaucrats. I'm documenting all of this, for the future, for historians who will read these accounts and wonder how a civilization could be so comprehensively blind to its own destruction. Though increasingly, I wonder if there will be future historians. If there will be a future. Or if I'm just chronicling the final chapter of a city too corrupt and too willfully ignorant to deserve survival, but which deserved better than to be sold back to the empire by its own nobles' greed and ignorance. The city today, the chaos you inhabit without comprehending, and which I'm exhausted from explaining to an audience that doesn't listen, within the four rings, life continues its chaotic rhythm. The forges never cease. Their clang of hammers plays like endless music, while the air chokes with the thick smell of molten iron. Streets remain packed shoulder to shoulder, shouting, a chaos of commerce where every transaction conceals a bribe and every agreement masks betrayal. I've described this pattern in 17 different publications. I've analyzed its historical development across 9 centuries. I've traced the architectural evolution of each ring, the demographic shifts, the economic patterns, the social stratification. No one cares. You live in it. You profit from it. You perpetuate it. But you don't understand it because understanding would require reading something longer than a merchant's ledger. The thing about Banic is, it's big enough to disappear in, big enough to become someone N. This cuts both ways. Yes, it allows refugees and fortune seekers to reinvent themselves. But it also allows imperial agents to establish cover identities. It allows conspirators to meet in shadows. It allows revolutionary organizers to recruit in the lower rings while the nobles remain blissfully ignorant in their palaces. The 19 mercenary lodges maintain their uneasy balance of power, selling their services to the Duke while simultaneously threatening his rule. This arrangement has worked for 65 years. It will work until it suddenly doesn't, likely when the charcoal runs out and no one can afford to pay them anymore, or when someone, say, a revolutionary promising noble wealth for redistribution or an imperial agent offering gold from deeper coffers, makes them a better offer, at which point you'll all act surprised, shocked, betrayed, despite the fact that I've been writing about this exact vulnerability for decades. The shanty town beyond the open wall continues to grow, its population swelling with refugees from the burning hinterlands. Within that sprawling poverty, Silferia's great church offers the only hope many will ever know, a spiritual refuge from the corruption that defines the inner rings. Note well, when people lose faith in earthly power, they turn to divine power. When they turn to divine power in sufficient numbers, earthly power becomes irrelevant. We've seen this pattern in the historical record 17 times. It always destabilizes existing structures. I documented every instance, with primary sources, with testimonial evidence, with demographic analysis showing the exact threshold at which religious movements transform from spiritual comfort to revolutionary force. That threshold is 40% of the urban poor population. Current estimates put Silferia's followers at 38% and growing. I presented this finding to the Duke's Council 3 months ago. They thanked me for the interesting statistics and moved on to discussing the upcoming festival season. We are 2 percentage points from a religious revolution that could topple the entire ducal system, and they're worried about festival decorations. But here's what really terrifies me. What if Silferia's church has been infiltrated? What if imperial agents are using it as an organizing structure? The empire has always understood that religion is the most effective tool for controlling populations. They've always co-opted local faiths rather than suppressing them. What if those refugees flowing into the shanty town aren't just fleeing Ael's army? What if some of them are Ael's army? What if the church is being used to organize them? What if the coming religious revolution and the coming revolutionary army are the same thing? But you won't investigate. You won't ask questions. You won't do anything that might interfere with your comfortable certainties. Nobles like Countess Valeria, Duke Edric's mother, and Earl Ariniel, Duchess Lyrian's father, maintain their own enterprises and estates, each commanding sufficient wealth and influence to potentially challenge or support the Duke, depending on how political winds shift. The household staff, from steward Jaron managing finances to physician Ilara tending the sick, all participate in the great machine of exploitation that extracts wealth from the countryside and concentrates it within the rings. Any one of them could be compromised. Any one of them could be feeding information to imperial agents. Any one of them could be positioning themselves to benefit from regime change. I'm not paranoid, I'm informed. There's a difference, though you wouldn't know it. This is Banic in the year 1300, ancient, corrupt, wealthy beyond measure, and facing threats both old and terrifyingly new. The ringed city endures, as it has for 1,000 years, through ruthless pragmatism and the willingness to pay any price for survival. But what happens when the price becomes independence itself? What happens when survival means accepting imperial protection? What happens when all our ruthless pragmatism leads us right back to the chains we paid 56,000 lives to escape? Whether Duke Edric can navigate succession crises, revolutionary armies, economic sabotage, and coordinated imperial infiltration remains to be seen. The historical precedents are not encouraging, but one truth remains constant. Banic bows to no one willingly, and it has survived worse than this before. Though I notice our survival has always come at a price others pay. The charcoal workers burning in their towns paid it most recently. The imperial sailors pay it annually, the shantytown poor pay it daily. Perhaps one day the bill will come due for those of you in the inner rings. History suggests it's overdue, and when it comes due, when the charcoal runs out and the forges go cold and the mercenaries turn on their employers and Ael's revolutionary army marches through the open wall while imperial soldiers step through Warren gates into the ducal ring and Silphiria's faithful rise in coordinated fury, I'll be here, in the archives, writing it all down, for an audience that will never exist. Because you're all going to die without ever reading a single damned word I've written. 43 years of my life spent preserving knowledge for a civilization determined to ignore it. 43 years of documenting patterns for leaders who refuse to recognize patterns. 43 years of screaming warnings into a void of willful ignorance. 43 years of watching imperial reconquest unfold in slow motion while everyone pretends it's not happening. Why do I continue? Habit, I suppose. Or hope so thoroughly beaten down by experience that it barely qualifies as hope anymore. Or perhaps because someone should bear witness to this slow-motion catastrophe, even if that witness dies unread and unmourned in an archive that will probably burn when everything else does, or gets shipped back to the Imperial Library where it came from, once you've all signed the voluntary reintegration documents. Arch-Custos, Master Historian, Aldric Greymantle, Keeper of the Ducal Archives, year 1300. Learn from history or become a cautionary tale in someone else's. Not that any of you will do either because you don't read, and neither does the Empire need you to. They just need you ignorant. P.S. I've kept detailed records of which nobles have checked materials out of the archives over the past 40 years. I know who you are. I know what you haven't read. I know you think yourselves wise while sitting in comprehensive ignorance upon 1,000 years of accumulated knowledge. When the city falls, and it will fall, remember that you could have prevented it with an afternoon in the library. But you were too busy, too important, too certain that history had nothing to teach you. The Empire knows better. They've been reading, they've been planning, they've been patient. While you ignored me, they were listening. I hope your epitaphs are more interesting than your lives, though I suspect they'll all be written in Old Meridian.